Our first presenter today is Peter Marra. His presentation is the road recovery for the Western-billed cuckoo. Peter, I'll hand the room over to you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And good morning, everybody. So my talk is actually going to be more general than that. I decided to provide a broader framework for the something we're calling the road to recovery. How's that? Look okay? So yeah, so I'm going to give a broader talk on the road to recovery process that we've developed. And I want to emphasize that this is an exploratory process. We've been making this up as we've gone along for the last probably 2 years or so. So it's still a rapidly growing field. There's a lot to do, and there's a lot to try to figure out, really. And this is all really stimulated by this paper that we published back in 2019. It's a science pub that reported on the net loss of 2.9 billion birds, about 30% loss of the birds of North America overall, a net change. More than 300 species in decline. And this was sort of the first time that long-term population trend data were combined with population size estimates for 529 species to evaluate that net change. That's one of the things that made this so unique. And while there were, the reports of the loss of abundance, there was still, many species that were declining and continuing to decline to the point of, where they're getting to be what we're calling on the brink. And this publication really succeeded in getting a lot of people's attention around bird declines again. And we've been here before. I'm not going to go over those different things in our history, but these sorts of crises can tend to stimulate various things. Think Silent Spring. These are the things, the events that allow us to kick things into gear to allow us to reevaluate what we're doing to protect species. And are we really doing things that matter, or do we need to, how I've been referring to it, reimagine bird conservation? And I would say that I think we probably do need to reimagine bird conservation. So when you publish a paper like this, you don't go back to your day job studying redstarts or whatever you happen to be doing. You need to start thinking about, okay, we need to do something to respond to this. And so we created this thing called the Road to Recovery. And this name may change, but right now it's the Road to Recovery. And we developed 3 specific goals for the Road to Recovery right now. The first is to develop a process and to garner the resources, more specifically, to support that process for species recovery, starting with the species that we're calling on the brink, ones that are not yet threatened or endangered, but are sliding towards threatened or endangered, because that's at the point where they become problematic. Once they become threatened or endangered, they become points of contention among various factions. They're closer to extinction, and then they actually cost us enormous amounts of money. So we need to develop a process before we actually get to that point. Then once we sort of develop that process, it's about promoting the targeted and actionable science, including both biological and social science. And I'll talk about that today and really illustrate what I mean, to recover those bird populations. If you don't include the social piece, you're missing a big part of the problem. And then finally, increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of the implementation. So we're avoiding what we call the dreaded implementation gap. So these are the primary goals that we've articulated in the Road to Recovery. And our focus is on recovering bird populations, which is different than typical management of conservation of habitats or addressing broad-scale threats. And I want to be clear, we're not saying that we shouldn't still protect habitat and that we shouldn't still address cats or window kills or whatever it happens to be. We have to do that. But now what we're saying is, folks, we've got to do more. We're experiencing the 6th mass extinction, species decline before they go extinct. And we need to do something before they get to that point, before they get to the point of where, like with the Western yellow-billed cuckoo, where they have to be threatened or they have to be listed as threatened. But that means we need to understand species-specific things. Different species are unique in so many ways, and they may be limited by very different factors. So this is really what we're talking about. It's understanding the causes of bird declines on a species by species basis for at least those species on the brink. And that means understanding what's going on throughout the annual cycle in some cases. So the focus here that I'm talking about for the road to recovery is on species recovery. All right, it's been reserved to the threatened and endangered status before. We're saying we need to sort of increase that list now, even before regulatory action is then mandated. The thing I want to mention, though, is that, yes, while habitats are important, species that are on the brink, this other list, may be limited, and in Western yellowbills as well, may be limited by a number of factors, not just by habitat. Habitat is by all means important, but there may be other things going on there, and we can't just channel our minds to focus just on habitat. In fact, when we look at examples of the past, many of these examples, in fact, most of these examples, were not limited by habitat alone. Kirtland's warblers, yes, there was an important successional stage issue there with fire dependency with jack pine, but it was also cowbird parasitism that had to be addressed. Lesser yellowlegs, it's very possibly overharvesting in the Caribbean. Bald eagle, osprey, brown pelican, DDT was what was driving those species to the brink. Condors, California condors, it's lead shot. With many other species, it could be pesticides. Yeah, with greater sage grouse, it's habitat in the landscape that's probably critical in that case. But again, we can't assume we understand what's going on unless there's enormous amounts of evidence to point to what is limiting those populations. And when you find out what's limiting, then you can be very strategic and thoughtful about answering the problem. So what's the R2R approach for recovering bird populations? Well, it's first about deciding which species to focus on first, using our several new metrics of urgency based on recent species trends, targeting research to fill critical knowledge gaps to determining limiting factors. And there's a variety of things that we can talk about in the Q&A that allow us to get at this even faster than we've ever been able to do before. Some of that means new methods for collecting the data so we can advance species towards recovery even faster. And also then developing this strategy for species recovery. That's the final case, is once you identify the limiting factors, how do you actually address those issues? In some cases that may not be addressable. In some cases it may just be impossible. So we have to come up with secondary or tertiary approaches to identify how to recover those species. So this is something we're calling the pyramid model we developed to describe the R2 process. And I should also say that this is not by any means my approach. This is a group approach. There's a small group of us that have really moved this forward, and then we put together a board of advisors that have been really critical in helping move the road to recovery forward. So while I'm presenting this talk, this is a group effort by all means. And so this is the R2R pyramid that identifies specific steps towards understanding where the limiting factors are for a particular species. It starts off with sort of a species at a 1, where we know almost nothing, all the way to a species that we would classify at a 7, where that population might already be recovering at that point. So a species like an evening grosbeak, where 90% of its population has declined, we just don't know what's going on. We don't know where these species go. We don't know where individuals go, different populations. We don't know what is causing the decline. But we can actually go through all the species on the brink, say the 50 or so species that we have, and classify them and where they are on this pyramid. But the thing that we need to remember is that we can't just go about this and answer the biological questions. That would be really silly. Bird conservation involves humans, just like the problems that are created are primarily human-created problems. So clearly, if we're going to approach recovery, it would not be successful without considering the needs and values of people. And that means from the policymakers and the land managers to the food producers and the consumers. This is a broad group of stakeholders that have to be thought about. People who are contributing to the habitat loss or the threats, and those peoples that are stakeholders in the ultimate recovery of those species. That whole process has to be brought together in something we're calling it's been called, not a name we came up with, co-production. Others have called it sort of a co-creation process. But this brings in the field of social science. And when combined with the biological sciences, this is where we think the real magic's going to happen with helping to recover species losses. So then how do we incorporate these human dimensions into this species recovery process? Well, we think that there are two pyramids now. One which has this biological approach, and the other which has the social science approach. And this is what's really going to make recovery ultimately sustainable. And so we created this secondary pyramid that's meant to parallel the biological species pyramid, which starts with recognizing the importance and prioritization of various resources that might be necessary, to developing a co-production research strategy, to going and engaging stakeholders throughout this process, and stakeholders that are not just on the breeding grounds, but maybe stakeholders that are also on the wintering grounds. When you intersect these two pyramids, that's a tricky thing. That's something that we're still trying to figure out. But this is what we're sort of bringing together to think about this recovery process, about integrating the biological and the species biology with the social science piece of the story that's typically causing the problems and will lead to this what we think will be a more seamless recovery process. So rather than focusing on those more complicated pyramids, I'm going to break this down, and we've broken this down to 4 key phases for the recovery process. The first phase is assessing and learning. That's the biological data collection piece. And the second phase is the planning and designing, and those two tend to emphasize more of the species biological piece, the biological science piece. And the second phase is emphasize more of the social science, the piloting and the implementing, and then the monitoring and evaluating to make sure that what we're doing is actually working and contributing to the recovery process itself. So let's talk about the assessing and learning. And this is where the recovery process begins, with a phase that's really about collecting the baseline information that might actually be available in the literature, or that might be in need of collection. And this can involve not just the biological, but it can also involve some social science as well to fill in those gaps. Let's maybe look at a bit of an example. This is the pinyon jay, but this would be our species priority. We know it be we've put it on the species of the Brink because we've got several different metrics that we've used. But what do we know about this species? Do we know its migratory connectivity? Do we know where they are throughout their entire annual cycle? What do they overlap with from a biological perspective? What do we know about the species vital rates? Here's another example, a yellow rail. So once we identify that species, then we can say, what do we know about where it is? Do we know something about its migratory connectivity? Are there certain things that we can collect, baseline information? Are there data on science, on survival and reproduction out there that we can then pull together to understand where the threats happen to be? Are those threats causing additive versus compensatory mortality? And then we can start to build models to allow us to assess when and where in the annual cycle the limitation might be happening. So there are a lot of more detailed steps that I can go into during the Q&A, but it's not just that. At that stage, somebody have a question?
Matthew Johnson's iPhone.
Oops.
Hi, can you please remember to mute yourselves?
Yeah, thanks. So at this stage, it's also important that we start to map out on the social science stage who the stakeholders might be, and not just on the breeding grounds, but also on the wintering grounds, that conservation partner base. But it's important to start to understand who all the various players might be, where the threats might actually be occurring at a sort of a different scale, less of the biological understanding and more on the social sides of things. So identifying those people, understanding their roles, and starting to think about the objectives that those people might play in a co-production sort of a process. So it's sort of an initial understanding of how these different layers from the biological to the social science might work. And, folks, I wish I could say that this is a really clear process. It's not a really clear process. It's messy, as are a lot of the data that we will be dealing with from the biological side. But we think that this is a critical process moving forward to actually allow us to be more effective. So once you've established that understanding of where we are in the biology, once you've established the partnership base, we think this is where the co-production can start to begin to fill in the identified gaps. Once everyone's in agreement with the things that need to be understood, whether it's starting off with basic research around the species, or it's other parts of those pyramids that need to be filled in. So the first gaps we feel tend to lean more towards the biological, but then you start to move more towards the social, identifying that conservation base to fill that in. So it's going to vary by species. It's going to vary by a whole suite of different things. So these are going to be customized for each species as you start to understand what's going on. But then you've moved from that assessing and learning stage into more of a planning and design stage. So this means we've already started to reached a milestone of identifying the limiting factors for a given species, the where, the who, the why, what's really limiting these species, their population dynamics. And this is really critical at the social science stage, because this is where we need to start developing the strategy that involves most of the human things that will involve the impacts on humans. It might mean stopping something that a human might be doing, like a habitat loss or a farming or a pesticide. This is where things get really complicated and are completely out of my field. This is where the human dimensions people really need to step in, but hopefully they've been engaged in this process already. But so it'll be easier to sort of start to address what these problems might be, because now the social science research probably needs to kick into gear a bit more as well to understand how we can mesh those limiting factors that we understand from the biology to the actual threats, the specific threats that are causing those populations to decline. That's where the focus is really helpful here, rather than just approaching it from a broad habitat thing or a broad threat thing without having the specific information in hand, knowing what's really driving that population decline. So the other thing to remember is that there can actually be multiple limiting factors that are driving the decline of these species. On the left, we have an example from the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture and the salt marsh sparrow. Here, they were able to show that one of the biggest limiting factors driving the decline of salt marsh sparrows is actually rising seas that modify breeding habitat and also destroy nests during the breeding season. So this is going to require, a lot of innovative salt marsh habitat modification to do something about that problem. But it's really critical to know what it is. So then you can actually know that if you modify that habitat, you should get a response, and you'll be measuring that later on in this process. In the case of the yellowlegs, there's been work going on showing that, at least for the eastern breeding population, it's most likely unsustainable harvesting or hunting that's going on in the Caribbean that might be limiting during the non-breeding season, that might be limiting that life stage. So by reaching out to hunters in the Caribbean, hunters that are also, by the way, potentially protecting critical habitats for these species, but by regulating that a bit more to understand what the population can withstand, that potentially will address that threat. But by involving those people earlier on in the process, it might have made that whole thing a little bit easier. But again, the goal is where and when is this implementation needed? And that's based upon where we know the population limitation is occurring. And so I want to make sure that it's also clear that this has to be done in a full annual cycle framework. You can just see from those two examples, one being a limitation that's occurring during the breeding season, another that's happening during the non-breeding season. And I would also add that even though we might identify that the limitations happening during the non-breeding season or the breeding season, it isn't always possible to do some sort of modification or some sort of a manipulation to remove or correct that threat during one period of the annual cycle. Think about marble murrelets that nest in the tops of very tall redwoods that are impacted by predation. It may be that there's very little we can do there, but there's something we can do during a secondary impact during other period of the annual cycle that might have a similar, maybe not quite as an effective impact, but something that also will help along the way. So we need to, at some point, look at all of our options as we implement some sort of conservation strategy. But it's critical that we take on a full annual cycle approach to this problem. So once we assessed and understand the data, the biological data, the social data, we begin to plan and design. Then we've got to put that plan into place to pilot and implement this plan. This is the ground phase, and this is really critical, and it hinges on really having that co-production participation in place, so everyone's motivated and their values are understood to move this forward in a way that's successful both for the people that are being impacted and the birds that you're trying to positively influence. So this is going to differ on private lands versus public lands. It's going to differ if it's in the out of the United States or out of our country and in some other country. This is a complicated process. That's why it's so important to include as many stakeholders as possible to maximize the impacts. Again, it could be in the US, or it can be in a tropical area where it's about influencing how something like shade-grown coffee might maximize habitat for tropical wintering birds. It could be anything, but it's that co-production process to involve those stakeholders to understand the biology as well as how they might be impacted by a particular implementation strategy. And then finally, the last stage is also equally critical, and that's the monitoring and evaluation. And the goal is to have reached this phase, minimizing or eliminating the implementation gap, this period of time where we're trying to, this gap that you want to avoid if you haven't brought people along on this process along the way. That's why this co-production was so critical. So monitoring, you need to make sure that your strategies are indeed working, that the populations are responding. So we need to continue to make sure we're looking at these data, monitoring these populations, that there is some recovery that's happening for these species. And similarly, we need to make sure that the monitoring of the social science strategies are also equally impactful, that the people that we were trying to bring along in this process, that whose livelihoods may have been impacted, their attitudes still continue to support this strategy. This is critical for the long-term sustainability of this entire process. Did we consider their values? Did we consider their well-being? Were their perspectives being incorporated? Again, this is all about the long-term sustainability of all people that are involved in this process. The human dimensions are critical for this to ultimately be successful. So this is where we are with the Road to Recovery framework for this species on the brink. There's, just to let you know, we are planning on expanding out what we do, but we've been pooling lessons from several workshops that we've held online, 3 workshops in particular, and a variety of meetings with a whole bunch of different people. The process, again, continues to be in development. There's probably going to be things that are brought up here that could modify what we're doing and how we're doing it. People are excited about this process, about expanding it out beyond the species that hit the threatened and endangered status. We're moving forward with several new steps. We're going to hold additional engagement sessions as a forum to learn about more diverse topics from the social science, bringing more folks around the social science aspects of this. We're engaging state agencies, partners outside the US. We're now moving more into an international piece, and I think we're going to be holding some larger international workshops. We're thinking about developing a nonprofit organization to actually take this on and move it forward, because it is filling an important niche. And we're not looking to replace existing efforts. We're looking to inspire more partnerships, support efforts that are out there, both with intellectual resources as well as financial resources, to guide the recovery where it's needed. And again, supporting current and future working groups, not to replace existing efforts. And by all means, to enhance the social science and the co-production processes that have to be put into place here that haven't been put into place before. This is sort of a new idea, but some groups are using it, but we think it's really a critical way moving forward if we're going to be successful in the long term. So I'll stop there and gladly take some questions. Hope that made sense for everybody. People hear me?
Yes, they can hear you. If you cannot, for some reason, unmute yourself, just raise your hand, your reaction icon, and I can unmute you. Or you can write a question in the chat if you would like.
To be honest, the biggest challenge for me being a biologist, I don't often think of the human dimensions piece. And that was one of these aha moments that finally hit me on top of the head for a variety of reasons. I think it's been hitting me on top of the head for a long time with a lot of my work. But in this case, I finally think I do understand the importance of bringing people along once you understand who the real stakeholders are. It may be as you get halfway through it that the limiting factors are in the Caribbean and nowhere else on the throughout the range of the species, and the focus might be on controlling over harvesting on the winter grounds, as is the case with the lesser yellowlegs. With yellow-billed cuckoos, it might be that it's not really riparian areas in the western part of the range, and it is something going on the Grand Chaco, where most of these species tend to be spending their wintering grounds. It's hard to know until you get the biological information. But bringing in all the players early is a critical piece of that puzzle.
Okay. We have a question in the chat. Okay, it's a long one, bear with me. The introverted co-production pyramid next to the R2R species pyramid is about regulatory. I don't know what's happening with that. I'm thinking about regulatory recovery planning. Agencies must develop recovery plans for species at all positions in the pyramid. Has your team put thought into how the concept of co-production can be incorporated into an effective recovery plan? E.g., where are we on each pyramid and what type of immediate versus long-term action should we include in a recovery plan?
I think our strategy has been, we have some new techniques now that allow us to be more strategic and more thoughtful in understanding where limitation might be happening. We now can track species like we've never been able to track species before. So we understand where different populations go. And we have lots of different sources of data to allow us to assess survival, overwinter survival, overbreeding survival, migration survival, as well as reproductive success. New trends and status and trends approaches to looking at eBird data or BBS data, and new modeling approaches like integrated population modeling. So we can actually, in a couple of years, figure out where we are most likely to get our biggest bang for our buck if we are to devote hard to acquire resources, funding, in particular periods of the annual cycle. We think we'll get a bigger bang for our buck in those short-term approaches. That's not to say that the long-term strategies aren't critical, and that's where that co-production piece is really essential. So I think I answered your question, but I think it's a combination of both. Ultimately, it's that co-production allows us to bring in the long-term sustainability, but it is that science, that new emerging science, both the things like tracking and monitoring data that can be put into integrated population models to understand what's really driving the decline, so we can be much more strategic, almost surgical in understanding why declines are happening. And so we want to make sure those threats that we're trying to eliminate are really causing additive mortality and aren't just threats that are compensatory. That's really what's critical.
Awesome, thank you. If you need a follow-up with that, please write in the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. This is from Patty Warner. Hi, Pete. These are some great ideas. Is there a reason the co-production pyramid is inverted, or is it just for aesthetics?
Totally aesthetics. And we're not convinced that we like the whole pyramid approach, honestly. And so we've gone from roads to pyramids to who knows what's going to be next. It is just aesthetics, but we keep going back and forth, and it may not be the final thing that ends up in a published paper. Patty, did it strike you as odd? Did it put the social science piece in a different position from the biological in your mind? Because it was going down the pyramid and supposed up the pyramid?
Yeah, something like that. I wondered whether there was, different weights put on the top part of the co-production pyramid, but at the same time, I thought, well, it just fits in really well like this too, so there might not be anything to it. I was just curious.
Yeah, it sounded exactly like our thought process that we came up with it. Yeah, totally.
I really like it though.
Oh, good.
Okay, so we have another question. Lily Douglas, I kind of like it because, it's a comment about the pyramid. I kind of like it because it shows that we're just starting out incorporating the HD aspect.
Yeah, and as you all move forward through this workshop, I don't remember what the agenda was, but I really challenge you to think about the HD piece of this, the human dimensions piece, in every step. I mean, you can emphasize the biological piece, but as you move through that process, it's like, well, how would you think about the human dimensions piece if you've got to incorporate, stakeholders from Northern Paraguay that involve indigenous as well as Mennonites, as well as, government officials? It becomes, a big headache. It becomes really challenging to figure out how that's going to happen.
All right. Do we have any other questions? You can also see these questions in the chat. Anyone can correspond in the chat if you'd like to. For
really
working, yeah, you saw it. Good job.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jenna brought up an excellent question. You want me to just read it, Kristen? For a working group, how do you ensure that you bring in co-production? How do you recruit or find someone with a background in social sciences? I totally agree. This is a real challenge where I'm still scratching my head on how you do this and how every recovery team that we're advocating for is going to, go get the Ashley Dayers. Ashley doesn't have enough time to be on 50 different recovery teams. And there aren't 50 different social scientists out there that understand this process. And part of what we're hoping to do is actually to start training more people in social science tools. And so I think that's one of the things that the Road to Recovery will do is we're actually thinking about so we have a director. His name is Paul Schmidt. He was within Fish and Wildlife Service as the associate director of migratory birds for years. Then he went to Ducks Unlimited, and he retired, and we pulled him out of retirement. But what we're thinking is there'll be on either side of Paul, there'll be a biologist who will focus and help with the questions around the biological science piece. And then we'll hire a full-time social science person who will also help to advise on the social science piece. But we're also hoping to enable maybe it's the joint ventures, maybe it's other folks, to come up with additional workshops, to come up with additional tools to help teach people that want to understand more of the social science pieces of this. Because there just aren't enough social scientists that have this as a research interest, for one, or have the time to do this sort of work. So we think we're going to have to retool a lot of biologists, maybe JV people, maybe government folks, maybe NGO folks in the human dimensions aspects of the social science piece. It's a good question.
Okay, so we had another question from Russell, and then another one came in. We probably have time for 2 more. We'll see how quickly we can answer these. You mentioned new metrics to show relative conservation priorities. Could you expand on this? Follow up, do these include a process where the inverted pyramid elements are represented?
I missed that. Is that from Linnea or from?
That's Russell.
Oh, I see. Let me just read that real quick. Sorry. Mentioned new metrics to showing relative conservation priorities. Oh, I see. So these are new metrics for species to identify which species are on the brink. And these are things like half-life. So how many years before a species will lose half of its population size, half-life extinction rates. Overall, constriction in range. There are 4 or 5 different, I think 4 metrics that have been used by the statisticians on our papers that have helped re-identify these species on the brink. And some of these are ones that have been used before. But this is something we're constantly always reevaluating. Not me, there's another group of folks, the statisticians, that are reevaluating these. And there's some tricky things here. So we want to make sure we get these species right. The good news or the bad news, depending upon which way you look at it, our species that we've identified as species on the brink align well with an independent process that Fish and Wildlife Service uses for their species of conservation concern list. All of our species are on their list. So we feel like our species list is pretty tight, unfortunately. There's another 20 or 30 species that don't have enough information, so they're data deficient, that we also add to that list as species that we want to make sure that somebody is thinking about or somebody is worrying about or is developing a recovery process for. My biggest concern is that species are going to slip through the cracks. So we're trying to identify who all the recovery teams are. Like this team is obviously really well organized for Western yellow-billed cuckoos. And we want to understand, so what can we do to help this process move forward? But there are other species out there that may not have teams that are quite as organized. So that's sort of the process there.
Okay, so we have time for like one more question, but so we'll do Linnea because she's next. So what about creating some kind of master registration database of all ornithological projects in the Americas so that we know who is working on what piece of the life cycle of each bird species?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, that master database, I think it's had different forms over the last 10 years, the Avian Knowledge Network, and I think there's a variety of things. There is this database that we're using to create this list is a database that's managed by the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And I think it is the kind of thing that we need to link with other types of data, like who are all the people that are, working on these recovery teams. So we can actually go and make sure that there's a back and forth conversation, there's communication between the recovery things that are happening with those species and the monitoring data that we might be looking at every 1 year, every 5 years, whatever it happens to be. I couldn't agree more that there definitely needs to be a more sophisticated monitoring database that includes both the people working on the questions as well as what we're seeing those species doing throughout their annual cycle.
Awesome, thank you. We have one more, we're just gonna fit one more in. When you say social sciences, does that include engineering and land development practitioners, or are you just talking about public outreach and education?
When I refer to social scientists, I mean whoever is potentially contributing or can contribute to this issue. So that involves a human piece. So yes, potentially environmental engineers, if it means, even though they may not be a social scientist, they are potentially intersecting with a human modified landscape, like with salt marsh sparrows, to do something to minimize the impacts of high water and that impact on nesting success of those sparrows. So there may be a need to incorporate an engineer into that conversation at some point. So I think we have to be really creative and realize that there's a lot of wiggle room in how we identify who's on both sides of either the social sciences or the biological sciences as we move this forward. This is not an exact science. We're really it's amazing to me that we haven't developed a more rigorous process like I've described here for other species. Even within endangered species, it's different depending upon the species. There's no set process for how things move along. There are regulatory actions, but when you look at how things have happened for things like condor or things have happened for Kirtland's warblers, those teams are different. How we move those things along are different. We're trying to come up with a standardized process that work for individual species.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you.